So I just finished an audiobook about Columbine. I listen to audiobooks in the car, and I've got a sort of a formula for how I pick what I listen to. That way, I make myself listen to things that I otherwise wouldn't, because I do this when I read books as well. I'll read the same books over and over because I just enjoy the story, and I enjoy the language, and there are particular authors that I just really... I like the experience of going through the book again and again, especially the more familiar I am with the story, the more I can anticipate the parts that are coming up. And so I have I'd say 3 to 5 authors. Let's say 3 to 5, because in my top 3, it would be Stephen King, it would be Thomas Harris, and it would be Clive Barker. Clive Barker I like because it's just very fantastic. It's very, just crazy stuff. And it's also got the gore side, it's got the horror side, and I really just have always loved horror, movies, music, books, anything like that. And then Thomas Harris, just because I really like the Hannibal Lecter character, and I really just enjoyed all of those Hannibal Lecter books, and I think that his writing has a lot to offer in terms of depth of research that's done to develop a character. So I think that while Clive Barker just is really good at creating worlds that don't exist and making things up, Thomas Harris is very grounded in the world we live in and trying to contextualize a character in terms of, those real world material things, or those artistic things, those architectural things, those actual quantifiable things that make Hannibal who he is. And then Stephen King is a lot of everyman type characters, and it really sort of straddles the line between the fantastic and the grounded, the grounded in reality. And he's much better when it comes to really underlining the lifestyle of the everyman, because that's sort of how he grew up. That's where he came from. He worked in, going through high school and finishing up high school, he worked in a mill, and then in college he worked, in industrial laundry, and and continued the mill work or whatever. And then when he was first, teaching, he was just really, they were just really like make ends meet type people. So that's what we see with a lot of his characters. It's just those paycheck to paycheck, average Joe, make ends meet type people. So those are the 3. And if I had 2 more to round that out, I would say Neil Gaiman, because Neil has a really it's a nice wit that's embedded in the writing. It's a nice British wit, and that really comes through with a lot of his characters, and I really enjoy that. And I just think that he does a really good job of putting that fantasy spin on things, but it's in a completely different way from Clive Barker. And it's hard to explain except to say that those 2 are, just really good fantasy writers. And then for the other writer, I'd say it's actually a tie between 3. And I know that sucks, because that's actually more, basically more that round out that top 10, and it starts to become a top 10 list. But it's Joe Hill, which is Stephen King's kid. It's Michael Crichton. And then it's J.K. Rowling, and I know that's funny, but the Harry Potter story is just so expansive across this well fleshed out universe of wizards, and it's a really interesting thing. Crichton, he's really got the science thing nailed down, and that kind of almost goes back to the Hannibal Lecter, Thomas Harris type writing, which is just very very contextualized in terms of, a lot of research that's done. Here I'm at almost 5 minutes, and I haven't even gotten to my point. And then Joe Hill is just, he's not a chip off the old block. I mean, he wrote, and his dad wrote, and that's similar, but the similarity with the actual stories is it ends there. It ends with the lineage, basically. So anyway, so what I do, my formula for listening to audiobooks is I listen to one fiction book that's non-series related. So it's basically a one shot is what you'd call it if it was comic books. And then I'll listen to a non-fiction book, and then I'll listen to a fictional book from a series. And right now I'm going through The Passage, because I never actually finished that series by Justin Cronin. So I'm on that now, but the non-fiction book that I just finished was Columbine. And it was a very interesting book that got me thinking about how we deal with mental illness and how we deal with mental issues and psychoses and things like that. And I think we all have situations that arise in which we are fighting something. You know, we're fighting issues with eating disorders, and we don't classify them as eating disorders, but if we're overweight, chances are we have some sort of an eating issue. It could be that we have depression. It could be that we have anxiety. It could be that we have anger management issues. And how we choose to deal with those things is very individual. And some people seek out help, and some people feel like that help is what gets them on the right path. And I was actually in a meeting yesterday where it was kind of a little bit off topic, but someone was talking about ADD and also dealing with a relative who had dementia, and the fact that they sought help just to have someone to talk to try to, you know, work through those issues, and how it was helpful. And then you've got the Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold story from Columbine, and how after the fact the parents and the police and everyone involved in the aftermath really sort of uncovered that there were all of these issues, and that Dylan Klebold was suicidal, and that Eric Harris was basically a psychopath, and nobody really understood that. So very interesting how they chose to manage that issue, or not manage that issue as the case may be, and how it really runs to extremes. You know, for some of us, it's a minor issue and it doesn't impact anyone else. And then in other instances, we're dealing with an issue that ends up manifesting itself in the form of violence against others. And then in some instances, in some extreme cases, we see violence carried out at a very large scale with a lot of casualties and a lot of far-reaching impacts, not just for those that are injured and for those that are affected by the injured, but societally. We see, the impact of Columbine even now. Like, you say the word Columbine, and that's what everyone associates it with, is the shooting, with the shooters, with, that whole, mistaken identity of a trenchcoat mafia and goth culture and things like that, which wasn't the case. So it was very interesting to listen to the accounts of that. But then the other thing that was interesting about that was this evangelical angle, and the fact that religious fervor just really sprang up in that area as a counter movement against the violence and against the anger and everything else. But that was not really legitimate or a move in the right direction, because it was really these churches and these evangelists and reverends or whatever trying to sort of take advantage of the situation for the sake of their flock, and increasing their numbers in their churches, which it didn't really say in the book. It didn't really get into that, but it did sort of like create this, read between the lines type, commentary on that. So anyway, that's not a book that I otherwise would have read, but I think the way that I approach audiobooks is good, because it really forces me to think outside the box a little bit and to go beyond those favorite authors and just to listen to the same stories over and over again. And with the nonfiction in particular, it provides me with an opportunity to learn something. So I really did learn a lot with that story. It was hard to get through. It was quite a struggle to get all the way to the end, and there were a couple of times it was like, yeah, I get it, I get it, and I'm done. But if I start to listen to a book, I finish, and And yeah, so you really do stand to learn something as well as just listening to stories on audiobooks. So that was it. Just some thoughts on that book, and then just on audiobooks in general.